This is Research Like a Pro, episode 82, Military Service Records with Michael Strauss. Welcome to Research Like a Pro, a genealogy podcast about taking your research to the next level, hosted by Nicole Dyer and Diana Elder, Accredited Genealogy Professional. Diana and Nicole are the mother-daughter team at FamilyLocket.com and the creators of the Amazon best-selling book, Research Like a Pro, a Genealogist's Guide. I'm Nicole, co-host of the podcast. Join Diana and me as we discuss how to stay organized, make progress in our research, and solve difficult cases. Let's go. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the show. I'm Nicole Dyer, co-host of the Research Like a Pro genealogy podcast. I'm here with accredited genealogist and co-host Diana Elder. Hi, Diana. How are you?
I'm doing well. Nicole, how are you doing?
Great. Have you recovered from SLIG yet?
Yes, I am finally getting back to work and getting rested up again after a week of not getting enough sleep. So it was a great week, and I'm glad to be done, I have to admit.
It was a wonderful week, and we had the chance to see our guest today there, Michael. Today we are interviewing Michael Strauss, an accredited genealogist, about military service records. Hello, Michael. Welcome to the show.
Well, hello, Nicole and Diana. It's good to hear from both of you.
Well, let's start off with kind of an introduction of Michael. I first met Michael, I believe it was at a BYU Genealogy and Family History Conference a few years ago. And then because we both present at similar conferences, we just kind of keep running into each other. And last week at SLIG, Michael coordinated an entire course. And so it was fun to see that he was doing that. I didn't take that course. However, I would love to take your course sometime. But can I just ask, when did you get started with your actual genealogy research?
Well, Diana, I started doing genealogy research when I was a teenager. So I started when I was 12 years old. For me, it was kind of an interesting way of getting involved with family history, as it was a middle school project for me at the school I attended in Pennsylvania. I'm a Pennsylvania native. And I remember getting the assignment in it was a humanities assignment, but it was part of my history class. And when I did that, I went home to my parents, basically asking for help. And my parents pretty much pushed me aside and kind of sent me to my grandparents, who were obviously older, and asked me to contact them regarding family history information. And I, like a typical 12-year-old, had no interest in doing this. It was like, oh, this is so boring. I don't think I want to do this. And I did, and immediately I could not believe how much fun this was. And the rest is history. I continued doing it and have continued since that time for over 40 years.
So you are a bit of an expert in military records. Is that right?
Yeah, I do a lot of military research. Most of my lectures center around both military and federal records, as obviously military records are found inside of federal records.
So I'm sure there's something that kind of attracted you to military records. Was it living in Pennsylvania, the site of so much warfare, with Civil War, Revolutionary War? Did that lead to your interest, or just because as a teenager, that just seemed like really an interesting way to go with your research?
Well, for me, it was a combination of several things. One was, of course, my interest in history. I loved all things history, and Pennsylvania is a very historic state. As you mentioned, there was the Battle of Gettysburg from the Civil War, a number of Revolutionary War engagements. Valley Forge was nearby my home, where I lived and grew up, and Philadelphia was close enough that I could travel there. But my interest also stemmed from the fact that I also am a Coast Guard veteran. So I had served in the military.
Oh, of course, that makes perfect sense. And I'm so glad that you've had this great interest in military records, because we are going to benefit from it today as we talk about the compiled military service records.
So, can you tell us about what are compiled military service records?
These are the records that essentially show that an individual has served in the military. Now, I just want to make one thing clear, that they are called compiled military service records from the time of the American Revolution through to the Philippine Insurrection, which would be roughly 1902. And then after that, they evolved to become called the official military personnel files, and they are held at different places.
Okay, that is really good to know. So, what is the cutoff again where they change?
About 1902, the time of the Philippine Insurrection, the war after the Spanish-American War.
Okay, thank you. So, what is the record group at the National Archives where we can find these?
Yeah, so the record group that would cover these records is going to be found in Record Group 94. That is a National Archives Record Administration record group. As you probably already know, that the National Archives was never set up for genealogists. It was set up for those doing scholarly or historic research, and it's really genealogists that use the records more so, obviously, but the records themselves come directly are directly recorded in that record group.
Wonderful. And is there a way that we can access and index for them online?
Yeah, there are a number of places to find them online. So you can get them online on both Ancestry, Fold 3, which of course is owned by Ancestry, and the Family Search also has a number of these records digitized already. Now, not all the wars are fully digitized, but a number of the early wars have already become available online in that regard.
So let's just go back to kind of the beginning about why these were even created and how they were created and when they were created. Can you tell us a little bit about the history?
Oh, I'm really happy to be able to tell you that because very few people know the story behind why these records exist. And I think this needs to be shared, especially to genealogists, because they would have more appreciation as to why the records were created. So, a man by the name of Fred Ainsworth, who was a colonel at that time, later would become a general. He was the head of the Record and Pension Office, and he had a team of clerks that worked for him. It was his responsibility to take applications of men who were applying for their pensions. So these were mainly Civil War veterans, maybe veterans that were from the Indian Wars, which were the post Civil War years during Reconstruction and the years later. And what he did was he would take the applications for the men applying for their pensions. These were elderly men, of course, or men who had been wounded. And it was his job to painstakingly go through the records to determine the validity of their claim. Obviously, he'd have to prove that they had served, he had to look to see if they had received a dishonorable discharge or a general discharge, and he needed to know that they would be able to obtain a pension based on the laws, because there are laws in place at this time, different pension acts. And you can imagine it became very painstaking to do this because he had to look up individually every person. So he approached the War Department with an idea that he would catalog, index, and edit these records. And he was given permission to do that. And in turn, he started working on all the different wars up to that point. Now, it's important to note how he did it. So he worked on some of the earlier wars first, and then he started working on some of the other wars. Now, he had some problems, though. He ran into some issues. So the Revolutionary War was a problem, and it required that he would reconstruct some of the records. And that was in part because of a fire that occurred in November 8th of 1800. It was a fire in the War Department that burned and destroyed lots of records. So he went to the Interior Department because that related to land. Men would get bounty land. And he went to the State Department as well. So he was able to go to different areas of the government to try to reconstruct those files. The only wars that he did kind of in real time, so he indexed and cataloged them as the events occurred, was the Spanish American War, because that was done at the time that he was doing all of this work. So the other wars were all cataloged and stamped the date that he did it. But the latter Spanish American War, the Boxer Rebellion, the Philippine Insurrection, those were basically done in real time.
It is amazing to me that because of one man, we have this huge set of records that shed so much light on our ancestors.
Oh, I know. It amazes me as well. And what's really neat is, and a lot of people don't know this, at the archives they have a room named after Fred Ainsworth. I would recommend that genealogists, if they make a trip to the archives, to please just ask to see the room, because it's just neat to be able to go into the room that was named after him, and we can thank him for these records. And the other thing that a lot of people don't realize about him is when the archives opened their doors in the year 1934, that was when it was created and opened to the public. Ainsworth, he died 2 weeks before they opened their doors. So, yeah, he never saw the place where the records were to be housed.
Interesting. Well, I'm sure you know the National Archives very well, having lived back east for so long, but now you're out here in Utah. So do you go back often for research trips?
I do. I tend to frequently go back. I do a lot of work with forensic work as well. So I do estate and probate work. So I spend a lot of time in New York, New Jersey, and the surrounding area. And being from Pennsylvania, I also visit my parents and other family members. So anytime that I get to go back for a research trip, I'm really agreeable to that.
Well, let's talk some more about how record keeping evolved after the Ainsworth period.
Okay, so what he did was he intended on having the records pretty much look identical. So for the most part, the records appear to be the same. So the records are divided into the different war periods. So the Revolutionary War is your first war that they have these records. Then there's the War of 1812, which everyone is familiar with. But there's a period in between that a lot of people aren't familiar with, and it was called the Old War period. So it essentially ends, or excuse me, it begins in 1784 at the end of the American Revolution, and it ends in 1811, which is the year preceding the War of 1812. There were some Indian wars. There was several smaller conflicts that we were involved in. Maybe both you and Diana are familiar with the Shays Rebellion, and there was the Whiskey Rebellion of 1794. These were emergencies in which troops were called up under the presidency of George Washington. And Ainsworth collected the muster rolls and indexed and cataloged those men. They were all thrown into that old war period. And then you have, of course, the Mexican War of 1846, the Civil War of 1861, the Spanish American War of 1898, and then it ends with the Boxer Rebellion and the Philippine Insurrection with 1902. So they're all done identically.
Thank you for explaining that. That's really helpful to understand. And I have heard of the Shays Rebellion and the Whiskey Rebellion, and I never considered that there would be muster rolls from those periods. So that's good to bring that to our attention in case we have anyone who lived in that time period in that place.
So let's go through each of the different wars and just talk a little bit about what is available for each one of them, because I believe they're all a little bit different. I think it would be helpful for our listeners to just focus in a little bit on each one. So let's start with the Revolutionary War. And can you tell us what is in those records?
Okay, well, the earliest war, the Revolutionary War, is going to be a little bit different than the rest. Remember, I alluded to the fact that there was the fire of the year 1800, so the records are not as complete as are the other war periods. So, depending on what Ainsworth was able to collect from the other three departments, again, Interior, Treasury, and the State Department, he was able to collect and try to reconstruct those men's service files. So, some of the information might not all be there. For the most part, you're going to have, of course, their mustering information, their muster out information. It's going to collect details about their service, but again, it's going to be limited. The records, of course, for the Revolution are fully indexed, and they are available for the most part online. You'll be able to access these on Ancestry. That's probably the one of the nicest interfaces that will allow you to search the Revolutionary War period compiled military service records.
So one of the questions I have is when we are looking at our ancestors' information on Ancestry, is that all there is to it, or is there more at the National Archives? Because I know sometimes we get an index card, like with the pensions, and then we know there's a whole file behind that at the National Archives. So for these records, is the information we're seeing on Ancestry all there is, or is there more?
No, there's definitely more. There's records that were never indexed by Ainsworth when he was doing this. And I'm really glad that you asked that, because that's another area that I think is a little bit of a misnomer for researchers and genealogists. So when these records were indexed by Ainsworth, he collected what he had essentially. He was able to go through what was available initially, but more records were located, and at that time he did not include them inside the original compiled military service records. So there are documents and papers that are inside the file, and that's great. And that's what you're looking at. When you request the compiled military service record, that's what you're getting. But then there were documents that were unfiled, ones that never made it into the document that he had cataloged and indexed. They were just papers outside of the compiled military service record. So what he did was he indexed and cataloged those separately, and those were done as a separate entity altogether. So those are a set of records that people will omit looking at the archives because, well, one, they don't know they exist. So if you know they exist, you can ask the archives to look at the unindexed documents that are attached to the compiled military service records. Additionally, there were several others. So there was carded medical records. Not all the medical records made it into the file, not all of them. So they had separate medical records. There was something called record of events. An earlier name they were called was caption cards. That was the Revolutionary War era, but they evolved to become called record of events, or ROE cards. Now, what these were very simple. Again, these never made it inside the file. So these were cards that were cataloged for the military unit. So, Diana and Nicole, if you had an ancestor who served in the Civil War, for an example, and you wanted to know more about them, obviously you would get their service record. But the service record really wouldn't tell you what the regiment was doing. So if they served in the 93rd Pennsylvania, it would only tell you that the person had served, when they served, their dates of promotion, that sort of thing, and if they were hurt, injured, killed, whatever had happened to them. But you wouldn't know what the regiment did from day to day, month to month. The events cards that he created tells us what the regiment did. So those are an important part of the compiled service records, but never made it inside the files. They were kept separate by Ainsworth. The other last couple were related to bookmarks. So at the bottom of the service record, from time to time, you may see a bookmark notation. This is essentially a number. It's a series of letters and numbers. If you find a bookmark notation, that means there's another file on top of the compiled military service record, and you have to request that directly from the military archivist. These have never been digitized, they've never been filmed, they're only available on site in Washington, D.C. at the archives. To get a bookmark file, you had to have had something happen to the soldier that's outside of the routine. So the soldier had they made an error in the records. So they notated something in his original record that was wound up being an error. So the file had to be corrected. That's a bookmark notation. Or an individual of one I looked for, I noticed that almost all the men in one regiment had the same bookmark file. And I was like, why are there 600 men with the same bookmark number? It made no sense to me. I couldn't figure it out. So I requested the file for the individual I was interested in because I had the bookmark number, and it wound up being a cavalry unit. So all the men who had that same bookmark number all supplied their own mounts, their own horses. So the government paid them for it. It was something outside of the routine. So that created a bookmark file. The last two were the color troops records. That was obviously Civil War. But the color troop records that he created were a little different in that many of them included what we consider to be like manumission papers, where the former slave was released from slavery, and the master would sign off essentially saying that this individual is free and could now do as they please. So they had slavery related papers attached to the file. And then the last set of records that's outside of the CMSRs, that's what they're abbreviated as, was called the Ainsworth's list, obviously named after Fred Ainsworth. And they were essentially like the record of event cards, but they centered on the strengths of the regiments. So they would tell you the names of the commanding officer. They would tell you the strength of each company by number. So not only do you know where the companies and regiments are going, you know how big they are. So that's the records that fall outside of the compiled military service records that very few people know about.
Thank you for explaining that. And I've always wanted to go to the National Archives and see some of those original records. A follow up question with that is from the compiled military service records, this came from the muster rolls. Are the originals of the muster rolls and the other records still available for researchers?
Oh yes, they never threw them out. Obviously, they are the original muster rolls. Have either you or Diana, have you ever had the opportunity to see an original one in person? I mean.
No, I haven't.
All right, so just to give you an idea of what they look like, they're extremely large. So imagine a table that you might have in your dining room that's a regular kitchen sized table. They are about roughly about 2.5 feet wide by similar length, and they are folded. Multi-level folded, and these were the original ones that were carried into the field and filled out by the first sergeant, and then of course signed by the company commanders and then turned into the War Department. So Ainsworth intended for these records to be preserved, and that's another reason why these were created, because obviously they deteriorate over time. Now, you as a researcher could see those only in the case if the original record that Ainsworth created, the index that he created, if it's not readable, if there's something missing or something wrong with the record, then you could request to see the original.
That's so interesting. We're trained as genealogists to always see the original. And I've always wondered, should we consider those compiled military service records to be good enough, close enough to the originals, or should we, do our reasonably exhaustive research and go look at the original muster rolls? So what do you think?
Well, remember, they are abstracted word for word. So every word that he took off the originals, he put onto the cards that he had created. So it is a mirror image of the records exactly as they're filed. You could ask to see one, certainly. I don't know what the reply would be from the archives. They're likely not to let you see it unless you have a reason to be able to see it, that the record that you were originally looking at was destroyed or just not available.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Well, I was so interested to hear all of that. Also, while you were talking, I decided to look up one of my ancestors, are actually kind of a collateral relative, and I have a Conquest Royston who was in the Revolutionary War, and I'm just looking at his company muster roll, and I think there are about 16 or 17 cards, and they basically give the date and the company, and there's not a lot of information that appears on these cards. So when you are doing research, how do you recommend someone actually use these cards? Like in this case, with so many different cards with just a little bit of information, how would you typically use that to put together a case?
Well, remember, you are doing a full history of an individual. So the idea behind this is to use the compiled service records as a starting point. From there, you would continue on to other sets of primary records that would cover other war-related material. So everyone starts at one point. You have to have a starting point. You can't do military research on someone until you establish the fact that they had served. So that was the purpose of the compiled service records. But as you alluded, it has limited information. It's only going to pertain to their service period of time. As far as the genealogy is concerned, there's virtually none. I mean, it's not really set up to do genealogy as far as that's concerned. You would go to the next steps, and those next steps are the pension record. The next step after that for the earlier wars, up through 1855 at least, are to look for bounty land applications. Remember, our country was rich in land while we were poor in cash. So men could be paid for their service with granting them public domain land. And this was done for the first three major war periods: the Revolution, the War of 1812, and the Mexican War, which, by the way, is a separate topic altogether on its own.
I bet. Now, Diana asked you about what is available for the Revolutionary War, and we've talked a little bit about the Old War period. What can you tell us about the War of 1812 and that engagement?
Okay, so the War of 1812, of course, is our second domestic conflict with England. And as you know, the War of 1812 is going to have essentially the same set of records that the Revolution and the other wars afterwards. Remember, these wars all look similar. So the War of 1812, the Mexican War, the Civil War, the Spanish American War, the records are really all essentially the same in appearance. He took the same muster rolls from each war and essentially just indexed and cataloged them. So they are meant to look identical. I want to note that there was one change as far as the Civil War was concerned. Because remember, the Civil War, it's obviously Americans fighting Americans. We're not fighting a foreign power as we are in the other wars. So Ainsworth also collected the Confederate side as well. So the Confederate records were obviously in the custody of the Confederate States of America government. And when Richmond fell, those records were turned over to the federal government, and in turn, Ainsworth was able to collect those as well.
I'm so grateful he did the Confederate soldiers as well, because that is where a lot of our ancestors served, in the Confederacy. And I know I had one individual that I was researching and found so much information. It talked about, desertion and hospitalization and illness and then finally dying, but gave me the opportunity to trace him all the way through the war to his final death.
Oh, absolutely. You can follow it completely through. And something else that Ainsworth also did that I think was really helpful. I believe you had a prior episode on your podcast where you talked about men of similar names or same names, as I remember.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought this was important that he did this as well. So if you have a common name, you might have some confusion as to whether or not you're looking at the right person. Now, Ainsworth did these records individually by war, but what he also did on the index cards is below the name and the unit, because unit designations would be repeated in multiple wars. That doesn't mean the unit just disappeared, they would be reused in another war. And what he did was in parentheses below the name and the unit, he would put the war. So you would know you're looking at only Spanish American War compiled military service records, and you're not going to waste your time looking at the War of 1812 if you're not interested in that war. So he took out all that guesswork.
That is a great idea. So helpful. And I've often found that men of the same name have been confused even within the same engagement within the Civil War. But usually we can figure it out based on what county that regiment was mustered from.
Right, and that's where the record of event cards in the Ainsworth list will help you.
I have never used the Ainsworth list, so I'm excited to try that. The record of events have been so useful to me in my research with the Civil War. And, one record of events I'll have to mention, it mentioned that the book that the clerk was keeping was lost when the unit was captured. So they tried to reconstruct it later, but couldn't remember all of the details. And I thought, oh goodness, I wonder how much of this unit's information is accurate, because it looked like some of it might have been remembered incorrectly.
Well, nice thing about the record of event cards and the Ainsworth list, these have been digitized. They're on Family Search. So they are available from the Revolution up to the Philippine Insurrection on Family Search.
Oh, great. I'm going to go take a look at those after this.
You'll absolutely love them. They're really wonderful.
So it sounds like we need to check full 3, Ancestry and Family Search, if we're going to get a complete picture of an ancestor, because the records can be in all 3 places.
Right, that's all online, but it's not complete for every war. So take into account that it's going to be not everything online, but what's not online is available on site.
Okay, so if we're going to really dig into these military records, we need to really educate ourselves. And this is perfect. This entire podcast, I think we're all learning so much. I really love that you went in depth on how these were created, because Ainsworth, I'm looking at a card right now, he created this entire card, right? So he's got, like you were mentioning, the war and a place for the name and the regiment and a place for all the different things that could have happened to the individual, like casualties or extra remarks. So he had to come up with these cards. Is that correct? He's the one, his department created the formatting of these cards.
That is correct. It was a printed form that he created that was reused over and over and over again for each war period.
So interesting. I think I have looked at these hundreds of times, never thought about the origin of them. I think I just thought that they were always there.
Yeah, now like Paul Harvey, you know the rest of the story.
Absolutely. All right, well, let's see. We have talked about several of the wars. I don't think we've talked a lot about the Spanish-American War. So tell us a little bit about what's available for that war.
Okay, so the Spanish-American War, just to recap, that is again the same format that they're using for the previous wars for the most part. The forms are reused over and over again, and they're tailored to the individual wars. So there might be some information that one war requires that another they just simply don't ask for in the service records. So the Spanish-American War is going to take into account three individual war periods. So it's Spanish-American War of 1898, which is about 7 months in length. You've got the Boxer Rebellion, which is the year 1900. That was that ugly little incident that we had. It was with the Chinese. And then we have also the Philippine Insurrection, which was from 1899 to 1902, when there's a treaty signed. But the war continues on with guerrilla warfare as late as 1913. But the records themselves, again, are found within the compiled military service records, and these are cataloged and indexed by Ainsworth as the events occur. And he is doing this based on the muster rolls at the time because they're current.
Good to know. We haven't talked very much yet about the Navy and the Marine Corps. Can you tell us what records are available for these two?
Okay, I'm glad you mentioned that, Nicole, because that's also important to know. So Ainsworth touched on his records for all his war periods strictly based on the Army, and his was strictly volunteers. So after he'd completed this, he went back to the War Department and said, I'd like to now do the regular Army. This is not the Navy, this is not the Marine Corps, this is not the Revenue Cutter Service. This is the regulars. So they did not let him do it. And hence, the regular Army has no such listing like this. If you have someone in the regular Army, you're going to have to contact the archives. The only thing that's online for the regular Army was the original ledger books that enlist the enlistments themselves. And that's it. Beyond that, you have to go to the archives for everything else to reconstruct the entire service file. If they were wounded, discharged, dishonorably discharged, captured, anything that would have happened to someone in the regular Army, you have to go through the process at the archives. Now, that's the regular Army. So the Navy and the Marine Corps and the Revenue Cutter Service were all done differently. Ainsworth never collected these records. These were not in his scope of what he was to do. He strictly ended with the volunteers. So the Navy has a similar version of compiled military service records, at least up through the War of 1812, but they were not indexed by Ainsworth. They were done by someone else. And afterwards, the Navy created what were called rendezvous reports. Now, the name implies exactly what they are. Sailors would rendezvous at a specific place and they would enlist in the Navy. Now, they were in major ports, so Philadelphia, New York, Charleston, Boston, Baltimore, major ports where men could be easily recruited into the Navy. And there's a set of records created to show Navy enlistments up through 1891. After that date, the archives has limited records for Navy enlistments. They're essentially enlistment jackets, and then they evolve into the records in St. Louis, which are the 20th century records. But the rendezvous reports are online, at least from 1846 to 1891, and they're available on Fold 3. So they are available for free. So that's the Navy. The Marine Corps had their equivalent of the compiled military service records. They were called size rolls. So if you just recap this, the Volunteer Army is the compiled military service records. The Navy is the rendezvous reports. The Marine Corps is the size rolls. It's essentially the same thing. It's just really just redone for the branch of service. And then finally, it leaves us with the Revenue Cutter Service. Now, the reason I know about them is the Revenue Cutter Service in 1915 became the United States Coast Guard, and I'm a Coast Guard veteran. So I had it drilled into my head when I was in boot camp, the early history of the Coast Guard. So the Life Saving Service, the Lighthouse Service, and the Revenue Cutter Service all formed together to become the Coast Guard. Well, at that time, pre 1915, those records, they don't have rendezvous reports, they don't have size rolls. All they have, their equivalent, is called shipping articles. So each branch has their own set of records that catalog their service members, but they're called different things and they carry different information. So hopefully that helps a little bit.
That does. That's really interesting that only the volunteer records were cataloged by Ainsworth. And it does sound like it'll be a little more work to go find out about those regular Army enlistments and Marine Corps and Navy.
I mean, it takes some diligence, but once it's done, it'll be well worth your time.
For someone who doesn't know if their ancestors served, what would be their first step if it's not indexed online? It's just buried in the National Archives. What would you suggest that you do to try to understand their military service and try to find out if they even served?
Okay, so for the volunteers, it's obviously very easy to do it because most of the wars are indexed. For the Navy, you have at least the bulk of the years available online, so that's pretty good to do. The Marine Corps has muster rolls that will take you to the size rolls. So the Marine Corps does have muster rolls going back to the 1700s all the way up through 1958, and they're on Ancestry. So if you find someone in the muster rolls that's in the Marine Corps, well, then you know for certain there's going to be a corresponding size roll. So get the size roll when you go to the archives. And then the regular Army, again, they're indexed online as well. So there is a way to get, for the most part, really all the branches with some form online, at least as a starting point, with the exception of the Revenue Cutter Service. They're just really just not online right now.
Okay, so that is really good to know. This is a wonderful era to be doing family history, isn't it? With so much available online to get us started.
Yeah, so much has evolved over the years.
Well, let's talk about the OMPF files. What are those? When did they start being kept? How do we obtain them?
Okay, so what you're referring to is the official military personnel files. Our government has a habit of using acronyms to describe record groups. So the compiled military service records are also known as CMSRs. Well, it's the same thing for these records. So the official military personnel files are cataloged the same way. Now, these records are housed not in the National Archives in Washington, D.C. These are housed at the National Personnel Record Center in St. Louis, Missouri. So they are located at a different facility altogether. And these cover essentially 19th century wars. So they're going to cover World War I, World War II, the Korean and Vietnam Wars, and obviously peacetime periods in between, because we certainly had an army and a navy and our other military branches that certainly existed. They didn't cease to exist. It's just that we weren't at war every single year of the 20th century. So there are the peacetime periods where enlistments were certainly a part of that. And then we had that ugly little incident that preceded World War I, in which we pursued Francisco Pancho Villa. It was called the Punitive Expedition of 1916. That was that event that John Pershing crossed the border, and we had an army literally follow Villa to try to capture him. And there are thousands and thousands of soldiers who have their records in St. Louis that refer to that conflict as well.
Well, that's not something I've ever heard of, that record group.
Yep, it's another set of records that are available to us as researchers.
Now, a lot of people, when they think about researching those records, they think about the big fire of 1973 that destroyed a lot of things. So can you tell us just a little bit about that and what records are still available? How would we go about trying to find if our ancestors' records survived?
Right. So what you're referring to, Diane, is that huge disastrous fire that ravaged the building on July 12th of 1973. So the records themselves were housed in a archival facility in St. Louis, but it didn't destroy the entire building. It actually took 4 days to bring the fire under control. And when they investigated the fire afterwards, they were never able to determine the cause of the fire. But what they do know for certain is that it was a disaster to our federal government as far as record keeping was concerned. It affected the records of the Army and the Air Force. Now, I list those separately, and I'm noting this to you, is because the Air Force is created out of the Army. Individuals who were in the air service during the First World War, the aero squadrons, that was part of the Army's records. So the losses were pretty straightforward. So Army personnel who were discharged between November 1st of 1912 through January 1st of 1960. So you are taking into account at least 4 war periods. There's about 80% loss. So think about it from, say, a mathematical point of view. 4 out of every 5 records has the potential of destruction, either water damage, fire damage, or altogether, been burnt and it's completely gone. And in the case of these records, the archives has tried to painstakingly reconstruct these files. The other set of records that were lost were the Air Force records. Remember, it's a separate entity in 47. So in September of 47 through January 1st of 64, so this takes into account the Vietnam conflict, they experience about 75% loss. But it only starts alphabetically after the name of James Hubbard. So an airman in their ranks, it only affects half the alphabet. So the half of the alphabet that is affected is 75% loss. The Navy, the Marines, the Coast Guard, they're unaffected by the fire because they're housed in another part of the building that the fire essentially never reaches. So the archives, after this disaster, decides, you know what, we have to do something about this. I mean, this is a huge loss. You're talking between 16 and 18 million files, roughly, that are destroyed or some form of damage is part of that. So the archives decide, well, what if we contact veterans and ask them to reconstruct the files? Why couldn't we ask them to send in copies of their discharge papers? So people would bring in their own information and mail it in, and they would put it into the original files, and they would have now a reconstructed file. The other file type was called a burnt file or a B file. It's a burnt file. So some files you'll find were partially destroyed, but maybe not fully destroyed. So the archives will let you see those. And then the last type of file was called an auxiliary file. Now, if your record was completely destroyed and there is nothing left, at the very least, you will walk out with an auxiliary file, which is essentially a payroll record. So the payroll records survived. They were in another part of the building. So it will at least reconstruct some part of the service if the full file has been destroyed. So I don't know if anybody's ever explained that to you, but that's how they work in St. Louis.
That is so good to know. Well, it's interesting because when I was at SLIG, someone was telling me that they had requested their ancestors' file and that it was being reconstructed for them. So they said they needed some time, but then they could go there and, like you were saying, you would be able to view it.
So as a researcher, you just don't show up at their door. That's not the way this works. So the National Archives allows for you to just come into Washington. You can view the records and request them as you want. The National Personnel Record Center in St. Louis is not set up the same way. It's a limited facility. It has limited seating. They need to know you're coming. So there's one of 3 ways in which you get records there. You either make an appointment on a specific date and you request the records ahead of time. So you give them the list of what you want. They send you an email and tell you what's available. This record has been destroyed, but we do have the reconstructed file we could give you in place of, or we only have the auxiliary file to give you. But you know what you're going to get ahead of time. The second way is to employ an independent researcher, and the archives will give you a list of people to communicate with and work out arrangements to hire someone. And the third and final way is to do it through mail. It just takes forever, it seems, but they get an awful lot of requests in a given week. The other thing that I think people need to know about these records is what's actually available. What is considered archival? What can you actually see and not see? This is confusing because this is a new facility. Everything in the Washington archives is public record. You can see anything you want. At the Personnel Record Center is not the same case. So anyone was discharged 62 years ago or more, right down to the day, anyone discharged before that date is considered public record. After that date, who was discharged is not public record. That is restricted. So that's a rolling date. That date moves forward every calendar day. So that is how they keep that information secure. And if your person you were interested in was discharged less than 62 years ago, then you have to request through the Freedom of Information Act information on that person, but just know and understand that you may get limited information unless you are immediate family. So obviously we're talking about the Vietnam era. So if you are not immediate family, you're likely not to get a whole lot of information because it is restricted by the law.
Wow, that is such good information. Until we actually do the research, we order records, we have that hands-on approach, we just don't really understand what it takes to get a record. So this is really, really helpful.
This is something that all researchers need to know about.
Thank you, Michael. Well, I think we're out of time for today's episode. We have covered so much information. Diana, do you have any final thoughts and the questions for Michael?
I think that I am going to re-listen to this episode a few times because there was so much information, and it's just making me think of all the different ancestors who served in the military and how I really need to do much more research on them. So thank you so much, Michael. This has been fabulous.
I was glad to be able to help and to be able to have your listeners hear something that is really, really important.
Agreed. It is important, and you are certainly a wealth of knowledge on the subject. So we thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk with us today.
Thank you very much again, both of you.
All righty, everyone. We hope you have a great time listening today, and we will talk to you again next week. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you for listening to Research Like a Pro with Diana Elder, Accredited Genealogy Professional, and Nicole Dyer. We hope that something you heard today will help you make progress in your own genealogy research. If you like what you heard, please leave us a review on iTunes or Stitcher, or visit our website, familylocket.com, to contact us. You can find our book, Research Like a Pro, A Genealogist Guide, on Amazon.com and other booksellers. We hope you'll start now to research like a pro